Okay, so with that motivation that we can recite, or bring to mind the verse of Refuge and Bodhichitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Actually, in just a couple, I was going to just jump right into emptiness, but say, just remember, like bodhicitta, right? Like one point is, of course, bodhicitta is the very essence of all the teachings of the Buddha. The compassion, that compassionate wish is the essence. And also in terms of this sutra, right? We went over it before, so I won't take too long, but where it says, they talk about Avalokiteshvara, they refer to him in the sutra as the bodhisattva. It means somebody who's achieved bodhicitta, and then mahasattva, right? The great, maha is great, right? So a great being, and we said the great being means somebody who has compassion that embraces all sentient beings, right? Bodhicitta wish that has compassion for all beings. And even where it says, right, how should any son or daughter of the lineage, right? So the lineage means it's the lineage of compassion. So actually this sutra, this sutra is addressed in a way to sons and daughters of the lineage, right? Meaning, and so lineage in this sense means, right, like, in a sense, and it's interesting, isn't it? Like a lot of times when linguistically, when we say lineage, it means like where you were born, right? Your family lineage or something. But in this context, right, what it means is like they sometimes say, right, you're becoming, when you generate bodhicitta, actually Shantideva says that, he says, when you generate bodhicitta, you become a child of the Buddhas. So in one sense, you're a child of the Buddhas because, you sort of say, right, well, yeah, the main meaning actually is that you're trying to grow up to become a Buddha, right? Like, so in other words, by generating bodhicitta, that's the cause of you eventually evolving into a Buddha. And that, in a way, that compassion is born of the previous Buddha's teachings, right? So it's like your compassion is born of the teachings of previous Buddhas. And then, you'll, if you continue on a path of that lineage, the lineage of compassion and bodhicitta, then you'll grow up to be like your parent, in the sense that you'll grow up to become enlightened yourself. Actually, in a way, you could say that, right, you could actually say that, it's actually a fair statement, right, that you're, in a sense, your father is the Buddha's, the compassion, right, of the Buddha, and your mother is Prajnaparamita. Right? If you're trying to become Buddha, all the Buddhas are born of Prajnaparamita. Right? So you could say that metaphorically speaking, right? Method, right? Because method, I said that before, but method, bodhicitta is the main method, right? And metaphorically they talk about method as masculine and wisdom as feminine. So in a sense, your bodhicitta motivation out of compassion is like your inheritance from your father, and then wisdom is your inheritance from your mother, Prajnaparamita, as we evolve into Buddhas or develop into Buddhas. So anyway, compassion, bodhicitta is, we don't want to leave that out. Otherwise we're not like, this sutra is addressed to children of the lineage, right? And so actually by generating even like effortful, right? Sort of even if our bodhicitta is not totally spontaneous, if through effort we generate that compassion and that wish to become enlightened for the welfare of all beings, then we become suitable students of this topic or suitable recipients of the Prajnaparamita. Because that's kind of, the sutra itself says that, right? It's addressed to how does any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage, who wishes to practice this. So we ourselves become, even with effortful bodhicitta, right, where we give an effort and we try to generate that compassion and bodhicitta, we do our best, then we can say, okay, so now I'm a suitable student of the Prajnaparamita, the Heart Sutra. So anyway, it's quite wonderful. But okay, so that's the motivation. And then the idea today, like I was thinking about it, like, so actually we're really commenting, like really we're talking about emptiness, right? And we'll go through the rest of the sutra, the words and all that. But really we're getting, I mean, I was thinking about it, you could say that we're still on this phrase, beholding the correctly, it says, Avalokiteshvara said, right, Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So we're kind of analyzing, what does that mean, right? Particularly that last part. Correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. And what does it mean to be empty of inherent nature is what we're kind of exploring. And I wasn't sure which order I'll do this in, but I think I'm going to start where we left off, which is with the object of negation, right? Because when we say empty of, right, it means empty of something, right? And what it's empty of is the object of negation. That's the way it's explained. And I really wanted to go into detail about this point because it's, it's the most, in some ways, it's the most important point. It's also in some ways the most difficult point. But understanding it is a key to understanding emptiness. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that, and Holistic Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche, many teachers make this point. So I'm not making it up. But I wanted to kind of just reflect for a moment, because this is a very, it's a point that takes, Selenius I just mentioned I was watching last night. I'll mention this a few times probably today, but I was watching Selenius teach on the Majjhimaka Avatara, which is teaching on emptiness. And he's saying we have to use our reasoning and we have to think ourselves, in order to understand emptiness, we have to study and we have to contemplate ourselves and come to some kind of conclusions, some kind of certainty, some kind of confidence in our own understanding. But that takes a lot of study and reflection. And so I want to say a couple of things. Like one is, actually, if you, on this point of emptiness, right? If you, if you stay in Buddhist circles, right, and you read Buddhist books and you talk to Buddhist people, actually, it's really true that there are many, many, many different sort of ways people will sometimes talk about emptiness, right? And sometimes you'll see actually where people will talk about emptiness means empty your mind, right? Empty your mind of all thoughts. And anyone who's studied the teachings, at least of, for example, of Lama Tsongkhapa or Nagarjuna, then that's not the meaning of emptiness, right? And you should know that. You should be confident in that. So that if you're I just want to say that, if you've thought about emptiness and studied emptiness, then if you're somewhere and somebody says, oh, we're going to practice emptiness, so empty your mind of all thoughts, right? You should be able to know, well, emptying your mind of all thoughts is fine. There could be something good about that, but that's not the meaning of shunyata. That's, so it's not to criticize, if somebody were to say that, it's not that you think they're a bad person, whatever they mean. Maybe they have some purpose in saying it. But you should know with confidence, that's not the meaning of Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness. And what I'm getting at is that we have to kind of come to our own conclusion, our own certainty. This is my position. This is what I understand of what Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti are saying, right? And, because here in the Heart Sutra, right, he says, empty of inherent nature, right? So empty of inherent nature doesn't mean you emptied your mind, right? It means empty of something specific, right? Inherent nature. And then what I started to mention last time is that, so then within Buddhism, there are many different positions on what is selflessness or what is emptiness. And Actually, maybe I'll say this. Like, I was thinking, like, I was actually contemplating this myself, and I was thinking about how, like, so actually, I'll share, like, what struck me was His Holiness the Dalai Lama shared a personal story in the teaching. I'm going to sort of talk about it just a little bit because I think it's very significant. But also, then I was thinking about that, and I was thinking Lama Tsongkhapa had a similar story, and I've heard a similar story from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And it's like, it's this: it's that if you really study and practice emptiness well, right, like studying the meaning of these different objects of negation, then like then you understand the path, and then when you have experiences, you can analyze your own experience and know where you are on the path. Right? And so, yeah, so maybe I'll show the story His Holiness the Dalai Lama shared, which he shared on various occasions, but this time he gave like his own interpretation of it the other night, where he was saying that he was reading. He told the story. He said he was reading the Gompa Robsel, which is like the Illumination of Thought by Lama Tsongkhapa, which is Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary to the Majjhimaka Avatara, the supplement to the Middle Way by Chandrakirti. And it's a very famous work by Lama Tsongkhapa. So His Holiness the Lama said 50 years ago, he was reading that text, and there's a section in it where Lama Tsongkhapa addresses a teaching by Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna, which many of you have heard, which is the self is not one with the aggregates, and the self is not other than the aggregates. And His Holiness said, as he read that section and was contemplating it, he had an experience. He said it was literally like a lightning bolt hitting his chest, hitting his heart, right? And his mind completely transformed. And he had some kind of realization of that point. And he said after that, wherever he went, when he saw himself or other people, he felt he had the experience that it was illusion-like. And so what was interesting, so that he's told that story in various occasions, that he had this experience 50 years ago. He didn't mention it this time. In the past, he said he went to his teacher, Ling Rinpoche, right, who's his senior tutor and like mentor. And he told Ling Rinpoche, right, as a young student should do, right? He went to his teacher and said, I had this experience. And he said that what Ling Rinpoche said to him was, soon you'll be a yogi of space. And first of all, which is a wonderful statement, right, to get from one's teacher. But what's interesting is Ling Rinpoche said soon. He didn't say you already are, right? Because Ling Rinpoche was a great scholar, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama is. And can you imagine that, right? He had an experience where his chest was like he had been blown away by lightning. Everything appeared illusion-like. And he went to his teacher, and his teacher said, soon you'll be a yogi of space, which is actually, it was a very hopeful statement. But he wasn't saying you're done, right? And what His Holiness Dalai Lama said in commenting on that experience was he said he had realized a gross level of selflessness, but not the subtle selflessness of the Prasangika view, right, of Chandrakirti's position. He had realized a grosser level of the selflessness of persons, but he was still grasping on some very subtle level at a basis, right? At some objective, objective existence that's a basis for the self. Maybe I think in that case, it would be the mind. He was still grasping as if the mind actually exists from its own side. And it wasn't a conscious grasping, right? It wasn't like he was going around going, the mind is the basis, right? But he hadn't yet refuted that. He hadn't yet directly refuted that, so it was still there in his perception, was what he was kind of saying. Like, that's amazing, right? It's taking this deep, visceral experience, recognizing it's very profound and transformative, but it's not the final view, right? And there's a famous story of Lama Tsongkhapa. He had had some kind of powerful realizations where he would enter into these samadhi states and would be unmoving and would sort of have space-like experience. And they say, like His Holiness Dalai Lama with Ling Rinpoche, they say, Tsongkhapa had these visions of Manjushri, right? And so after he'd had one of those experiences, he had a vision of Manjushri, and he said, he basically said, these Manjushri, these experiences I've had of like non-conceptual sort of space-like experiences, is that the Prasangika view, or is that the Svatantrika view, of emptiness? And Manjushri said something like, it's neither. It's not even the mind-only school. You're not there. Like you're very far from the correct. And Tsongkhapa had these visceral, powerful experiences, but what Manjushri was saying to him was they're experiences, but they're not emptiness. Right? And so And I just once heard Lama Zopa describe a similar experience where he kind of had some experience, went to one of his teachers, and they said it wasn't the Majamaka, it wasn't the Prasangika view yet when he was young. He was a young person. And so the idea, though, is that, what His Holiness and what all these teachers are saying, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, is that, so we have to know what does it mean, right? You have to know very deeply, what does it mean, empty of inherent nature? And the next thing I want to suggest is ultimately what that means, Lama Tsongkhapa's position, to all the Tibetan schools actually, in general, maybe there are some individual exceptions, but for the most part, all four Tibetan schools agree. Chandrakirti's explanation is an ultimate explanation, is a kind of definitive explanation of the meaning of emptiness, which is this Prasangika school's view, right, in terms of the schools of emptiness. But I wanted to sort of emphasize some points, which are, one is for ourselves, if we were to realize even the lowest of the school's views of emptiness, right, of the different philosophical tenet systems, that would be incredibly transformative, right? And part of that is that so I want to go back to this idea of object of negation now. And I said, an object of negation is something we superimpose or project onto things that is not actually there. And I was sort of thinking how to start to talk about this. And I want to actually use an example for a second that's not about emptiness, but it's the same idea. It's the same idea of this idea of just superimposing and projecting something onto things that's not there that we need to then refute. And the example, there are countless examples of things, but I want to start with something very simple. Last time I was mentioning that Chandrakirti talks about 4 wrong thoughts, the 4 kinds of superimposition. And one is superimposing pleasure onto what is painful, right? So that's much grosser than emptiness. But I was thinking about an example of that, which was my man I knew. It was actually my mother's partner of many years. After my parents had separated, and then she was with this man for 20 years. His name was Sam. And he, when I first met him, he smoked cigarettes a lot. He was he was always smoking cigarettes. And and he was in his 50s, I think, when I met him. Probably a little over my age now, not much past my age now or something. And he was smoking, and of course, everybody, it was that era, right? It was everybody was saying to him, you should stop smoking. It's bad for your health. And his doctor told him you should stop smoking. It's bad for your health, right? And he loved cigarettes. He used to say, he just loved them. He was so happy to see a cigarette, and when he had a pack of cigarettes, he was so happy just to see them, it was and so he had this, when he would see a cigarette, if I saw a cigarette, I thought, oh, and if I smelled a cigarette, I don't like the smell. But for him, I could see it. As soon as he saw a cigarette or smelled a cigarette or held a cigarette, immediately there was a feeling of oh, that's wonderful, And then there came a point when he had, he was diagnosed with COPD, because of cigarette smoking mostly. And he kept smoking. He just couldn't, he was he loved the cigarettes, and then I can't remember all the other, he had various other diagnoses related to cigarette smoking. And he kept getting sicker and sicker, but he kept smoking. So there was this incredibly powerful superimposition in his mind, right, of cigarettes being attractive. And then I remember there came a point where he was diagnosed with lung cancer. And the doctor, and I think this, if I remember right, yeah, he actually told me, I can't remember if it was him or my mom told me the story, that the doctor said, when the doctor diagnosed him, he had COPD, now he had lung cancer, he was going to die essentially. And the doctor said to him, if you're not going to stop smoking now, don't come back to my office. I don't ever want to see you again. Go to somebody else. I refuse to treat you. I won't treat somebody who's going to keep smoking when you're at this point, and he went home and he thought about it and he stopped smoking. It was too late. He died of lung cancer. But my point is I was wow, it took that point, right? It took having lung cancer, COPD, and 1 or 2 other lung problems, And having a doctor say, don't even come back to my office, just die at home. Like, go to somebody else or die at home. I refuse to talk to you if you don't stop smoking now. And then he had some realization, I have to stop smoking. And my point is like, that's how deep, right, superimposition can be, right? It's that, superimposition, we can think of it as like something, I'm using the example of Sam because it's like, it could seem when we talk about superimposition as if it's something intellectualized, right? But that's how deeply, right? You could get a sense of how deeply he felt. I just need a cigarette, right? He would say that. And that's a gross level, right? It's superimposing pleasure onto what's a source of pain, right? Cigarettes were, for decades before that, right? His own children, friends, my mom, his partner, all kinds of people were saying, cigarettes are a source of pain, of suffering, of sickness. So it wasn't that he didn't hear that, and he was smart enough to understand their words, but deep down in his feelings, he felt they're a source of great pleasure. And that's, I'm just using an example, that's superimposition. Does that make sense? And in his case, right, you could say there was an object of negation. What was the object of negation that he needed, right? It wasn't about emptiness, right? But you could say he was superimposing pleasure, right, source of pleasure, desirability onto the cigarettes, and he needed to have an insight, right? A direct insight, wow, this is a cause of my suffering. This is a cause of my children. Me smoking, me touching those or using those is a cause of suffering to myself, but also to my children, to my partner, right? Like, anyways, he loved, for example, his children, he loved my mom. But by each time he picked up a cigarette, he was actually going to harm them, right? Also, not himself, his own health, but also them, because they didn't want to lose him. They didn't want to have him, have cancer and all that. And it was like, so you get the point though, it's like, first you have to know what's the object of negation, and then you have to negate it viscerally enough so that you can let it go. And you have to be like, it's funny in a way, right? We have to be like that doctor who said, don't come back now. You're going to die from this. I don't want to see you. We have to be that clear with ourselves about the object of negation is really wrong. It's that wrong. Does that make sense? It's a cause of suffering. It's a cause of immense suffering, right? And, yeah, anyway, so that's, and another point in Buddhism is if you think about it from this perspective, then if you think of that example of just Sam and his cigarettes, right? But then there are countless examples then of things to be negated, right? Where it's false superimpositions or false projections we have onto things, onto people, onto ourselves, and yeah, there are so many, aren't there? Like, there is all craving, actually. According to Buddhism, all craving, right, involves a superimposition of an exaggeration onto the object, right? Where you're seeing the object as more desirable than it really is. All hatred and anger involve superimposition, right? Where you're superimposing faults and like, it's all bad. This person's terrible or whatever, onto things, right? Pride is a superimposition, isn't it? I'm the best, or I'm the worst. There's another kind of pride. I always love that in Buddhism, right? Buddhism teaches there's a pride of saying I'm the best in the world, but there's another pride of saying I'm the worst, right? According to Buddhism, that's pride. If you say, so if somebody says, oh, I'm just the worst, right? Which people say all the time, right? According to Buddhism, that's pride because it's an exaggeration, right? It's a superimposition and exaggeration and a kind of grasping. And people believe those things. We all do, right? We all believe these different levels, different types of superimpositions so deeply, right? And so I was just reflecting on this, I'll point out something. So in Buddhism, in Buddhist practice, I mentioned this when I said like the term Buddha or Sangye in Tibetan, right? So it includes like eliminating all faults and accumulating all good things, right? So in Buddhism, there are certain good qualities we need to enhance, like our love, right? Our compassion. We all have a certain amount of love, but we try to make it, we gradually, if you're going to become a Buddha, you have to take whatever love you already have and make it infinite, right? Limitless. You have to take whatever ordinary compassion you already have and make it infinite and limitless. So that's one part of the path. But the other part of the path is elimination, right? And the idea with elimination, in a way, is this. It's eliminating superimpositions. It's eliminating false projections, right? And their seeds and their imprints, right? And my point I'm getting at, I'm just sort of, I'm not yet on emptiness even. I'm just talking about this idea of various types of objects of negation. Like, and the reason I started with the example of Sam and cigarettes is, I just want to point out, like, each of us has to kind of stop and think, like, we have to get to the point. It's easy to see I picked cigarettes because it was an easy one. Sam, I mean, he died of it, so it's easy to see. But the hard part is to recognize I have those too. I have things that I grasp at that are false, some totally false, and don't exist any more than that, good health exists inside a cigarette. There are things like that I project, right, onto other people, onto objects, onto myself, that are totally false and don't exist there, but I believe in them to the point where I would risk my life, or I would risk somebody else's life, or I would do all kinds of things, or I would work, or I would spend, hours and hours, go through incredible hardships out of delusion. And so a lot of Buddhist practice is, and this is hard, right, is recognizing our own superimpositions, our own delusions, our own projections, and challenging them, and refuting them, actually, and giving them up, right? And that's hard. It's actually funny, isn't it? Like, we sometimes think, oh, it'd be hard to give up, like, I don't know, some object, like to go off to retreat and give up your comforts or something. But actually, compared to giving up your mental projections, that's easy. It's like, it's much easier to go through an external, what's the word, appearance, because you could just do it. You could do anything for a few days or something. You could fast or something like that. You could cut your hair and whatever, and go fast in a cabin in Vermont or something, if you wanted. But if you bring with you your superimpositions and you don't touch them, then that doesn't lead to liberation. Is the problem, right? I mean, it's good to do things like that, but the purpose of doing things like that, and mostly, is to cultivate inner good qualities and to decrease these superimpositions. That was one time what Yume Kensho did. Somebody asked him, what's the sign of a good retreat? And he said, it's not having visions of deities, it's not having, whatever, good dreams, it's having more compassion and more love and less pride and ignorance and desire, So anyway, mostly decreasing those negative traits involves, what's the word, refuting objects of negation. So that's that part. Now, and again, those are all gross ones, right? Seeing what's a source of pain as pleasure, right? But now I want to get to the self, right? And I'm not quite at emptiness yet, but I want to start with one that's permanence, right? We're getting closer now to emptiness. So we have, Buddhism is asserting that regarding yourself, right, that you project an idea of permanence. And you might say, no, I don't. I know I'm impermanent, right? You could say that, actually. People do say that. No, I know I'm impermanent. But actually, well, I'll just share it. I'll just share an example. I'm giving examples today or something. But I was actually just reading, I'm in the midst of reading Michelle Obama's autobiography, Becoming. And there's a point where she was this very intelligent woman. At this point in the story, I hadn't planned on sharing this, but I'm just picking it as an example. At the point of the story I'm up to, she was already, a Harvard-educated lawyer, very brilliant woman with a great career, and she was already dating Barack Obama and all that. Very, very smart woman, and had gone to Princeton undergrad and Harvard grad school. So not, very smart, right? And she certainly knew all people are impermanent, right? But then her 26-year-old best friend got cancer and died. And she was utterly in shock, right? And she walked around and she was like, she walked around and everybody else was doing what she had been doing 2 weeks earlier, right? And she thought, how can they be doing that? People die. Don't they realize they're going to die? You know, she had this visceral experience when her best friend died. And then, of course, it faded, you know, after a little while, as it does, right? When your best, you know, if your best friend or a parent or a loved one dies, right? You have this shock and grief, and you look at the world differently. And then eventually you sort of forget about it. Maybe not in all cases, but most of the time, right? And my point is like, that's a sign, right? You haven't realized impermanence. You think of yourself as permanent, right? If it's different the week after your best friend died than it is other times, then you don't know that things are impermanent, right? There's a sense in which you grasp at yourself as permanent. And so we grasp it. So, and I'm just focused, we could do it with our best friend or, you know, loved one, but particularly we do it in relation to ourselves, right? So we feel, and actually it happens all the time, doesn't it? Like every time you make a plan, right? You have an idea of permanence. Like when you plan ahead. And I'm not saying planning ahead's bad, but if you check, right? There's a feeling there of permanence, as if you'll be the same then, as if you know, have some idea that it'll be similar at that time. And again, like that's why I used that example earlier of Sam and the cigarettes, right? Like where people said to Sam, and there were articles, people would send them articles, oh, cigarette smoking causes cancer, and it wasn't that he didn't intellectually know that, but he didn't know it in a way that changed his relationship to cigarettes, right? So we're like him about permanence. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, if you've come to Buddhist classes, you've heard that, right? All things are impermanent. And impermanent, it means momentary. In Buddhism, right? Impermanence means it doesn't last a second moment. It changes moment by moment. Right? So we know that intellectually, but we don't feel it the way that Sam didn't feel that cigarettes are bad. Right? If you felt it, Lama Zopa Rinpoche said that before. He kind of has said things like that. Like if you felt the truth of that experientially, impermanence, you wouldn't be able to stop practicing Dharma. You would be practicing all the time. He said, once you realize that, and Rinpoche Rinpoche says something similar. He said, if you realize impermanence, he said that becomes like incredible fuel. He said that, he gave an analogy. He said, I think his analogy came from, have you ever, when rockets take off, like there's a powerful, like when into space, right? Like there's a powerful main rocket that goes, and then eventually the top, they separate, right? And then a smaller engine sort of takes it, once it gets out of the atmosphere, to direct it around. And he was saying, he gives this analogy, he said, the recognition of impermanence is like that part. And then he said, and then once you get to a certain point, that's still there in a way. But he said, then once you realize bodhicitta, then that becomes your fuel. That takes you the rest of the way. So it was like when you realize impermanence, it has that kind of effect, right? So we haven't realized it. We know it intellectually, but we haven't integrated that. So we have this superimposition, like what is this projection of permanence. Okay, so now we can get to like, then what? So those are all objects of negation. And last time I said this point. I said Chandrakirti and Arya Nagarjuna say, if you're still grasping, if you're still totally believing in very gross superimpositions, it's going to be very difficult to negate subtle superimpositions, right? And so that's why I've been talking about one is to get an idea of what is an object of negation. It's something that you project onto something that doesn't exist there, right? That's one point. But the other is we have to be willing to face and work with our grosser superimpositions if we want to eliminate our subtle ones. Does that make sense also? So I'm just trying to point that out. That's why I'm giving these examples of gross levels of superimposition. Because if we're willing to work on those, then it becomes more possible to address our subtler superimpositions. And then among the subtle ones, I actually want to start with like so we're not yet at the Prasangika school, you know, we come in a little while, but I want to talk about now selflessness, right? Um, so I'm going to start with the lowest. I want to actually use the example of the lowest of all the four. Like so, in in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about four. I'm not talking about the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism now, but there are four philosophical tenet systems from India. Two of them come from the lesser vehicle, and two come from the Mahayana, great vehicle. And they're systems of Buddhist thought, actually, that the monks at the monasteries study, all of them. You know, so they're not like lower. I don't want to point something out about this. Like, so I'm going to start with the Vaibhashikas. That's the lowest of the four. Lowest meaning the least subtle. But the Tibetan, actually, Tibetan monastic tradition is associated with the Vaibhashika, you know, that with one of the Vaibhashika sub-schools of philosophy. So my point is that the Vaibhashika school is not like, when they say lower in the sense of tenet system, they're not putting it down. They spend years studying texts of that system. What they're just saying is it's less subtle, right? But there's an important point here, like because I think as Westerners we could have a wrong idea, actually, or maybe Tibetans do too. I don't really know, but certainly I've sometimes said this. We can sometimes think like if something's lower philosophically, it's worse, which is not the case. Actually, the idea is that the Buddha taught these because they help people, right? And there are certain moments actually where I haven't thought this, like, you know, if you were to ask me, like, you know, philosophically in the ultimate sense, what do I think is true? I would say it's the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, right? But in terms of like lived life, there are certainly many, many, many moments where if I could rise to the level of living in the way that the Vaibhashika school recommends, that would be a humongous improvement. And so in those moments, it would actually be good to adopt a Vaibhashika approach. Does that make sense? Kind of like, because that's the point in a way, you know, like the point is to change ourselves and improve, right? And there are times where what we need in order to improve is not the most subtle thing because it's not relevant yet. We're not at that level yet. We're not subtle enough. We're not. So I want to point that also, all these different Buddhist philosophical positions, you know, we sometimes people say it as if like, oh, they were useful for a certain kind of student. But what I want to suggest is that kind of like, you know, and that's true. And there's people say that and it's correct. But what I'm suggesting is, and it would be great if someday I could be that level of student. That's what I'm suggesting the correct attitude is. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm this great student who's a Prasangika level and some other poor schmo is, you know, not as subtle as me. That's a wrong understanding. Like, I think a correct understanding is like, wow, it'd be amazing to study. And yeah, recently I was having a conversation. I sometimes mentioned my best friend, and he was saying like he had decided that for now he was going to be totally identify with the mind-only school. He was saying like he realized like that would really help his practice, and he said, I don't care about Madhyamaka. I really want to practice this. He was trying to practice Mahamudra, and he said like, I think if I approach Mahamudra from a mind-only perspective, I'll make progress. I was like, that's profound, right? Whereas it's not that, you know, like that's very profound, right? Because it's like, well, it's like, what's going to help me make progress in my practice? That's very meaningful, I think. So anyway, from a Vaibhashika perspective, in terms of selflessness now, they talk about selflessness. The first thing, there's a gross and a subtle level of object of negation. So I'm starting to get object of negation now in relation to selflessness, which is where we're headed, right? So they talk about a gross level of their gross level of selflessness to be refuted, to be abandoned, is a permanent, unitary, independent self. So permanent, we already were talking about, right? We have that. We have this view of permanence. Then unitary means like what? Singular, right? And actually, just think, like, I'll just share this. Like, I've been thinking about these topics, and this morning I noticed this. Like, I you know, when I woke up, right, I brushed my teeth and took a shower, like in the morning, and I looked in the mirror, you know, like as you do, as people do, right, when they go in the restroom to get ready, you know, and I was noticing like, you know, just like, it's not intellectual, right? Because this is not an intellectual idea, right? When I looked in the mirror, it was a natural feeling of that's me, right? It wasn't like a conscious thought, but it was a natural feeling, right? That's me. And then I thought, because I'm studying, because we're students of emptiness, I thought, what do I mean that's me? I thought, well, it's like, it was a singular, right? That one wasn't, it was like a unitary singular thing that's there. That's me. And that's a very gross level of self. That's not the prasangika object of negation. I would think that's, now I think actually experientially that was probably the unitary part, right? It was like some singular thing, that's me. Because then I looked and I started looking at the parts and I was like, oh, that's just like a bunch of color, shapes, like, where's the me? And this is the hard part. I like, that was not a prasangika analysis, right? That was just some, while brushing my teeth or something, right? Some recognition that there was this feeling, and you have to, what you're trying to get at is that these are not intellectual ideas, first of all, right? They're visceral experiences, and they're how we view ourselves. And so you could ask yourself, even as you're listening right now, right? How do I view myself? And can you be aware of a sense of permanence or a sense of unitary or independent? Right? And from this school's perspective, right? Because they would say, like, it's really interesting in terms of the independent, right? Because they would say, that school says, for example, that there are atoms that exist. Right? But they would say, one way they would sort of analyze the self is they would say, well, the self seems like it's the singular thing, right? That's there. But from this school's perspective, anything that can be broken down, anything that disappears when you analyze it into parts, into it, if you break it apart mentally, then it's no longer seems to be there. That's, what's the word? That's just a conventional truth, right? And they would say ultimate truths cannot be broken down, and they exist. That you can't break them down. There's nothing further to subdivide them into. So they would say what's real, or like, what's the word? Partless moments and partless particles. So they would say, the basis of. So if I'm looking in the mirror and I think that's me, from a Vaibhashika perspective, they would say, well, no, wait, the body you're looking at when you say that's you is made up of atoms, which we would say too, right? Western science would say that too. It's made up of atoms, right? So they would say, if you analyze it, you can find, well, it's made up of atoms, so there's not some unitary thing there that's a body, right? And then there can't be a unitary self that's an ultimate truth associated with that body. It's not ultimately true. Right? The point I'm getting at here, though, is a few points. One is, we never even challenge that gross level, right? Almost never do we challenge even that gross level of, what's the word? Superimposition. Right? And if we did, that would be incredible, wouldn't it? Because if you could have the experience that there's not a unitary self, right? There's not, actually, right? Even from that school's perspective, you can see that. Well, it's true, isn't it? In other words, my mind is made up of moments. Actually, if you think from a Vaibhashika perspective, you actually can't debate that, can you? Like, my mind is made up of moments, and my body is made up of atomic particles. And yet, this is just their gross, even the Vaibhashika's gross level, right? But I seem to perceive this permanent unitary thing, right? The self that was there moment by moment as I was brushing my teeth or whatever, like, I didn't think it was changing instant by instant. I didn't think that the self of the brushing the back teeth was different than the self of brushing the front teeth or something, right? Like, it seemed like it was constant and singular. It was one thing, right? So it'd be amazing to challenge that, and that's much, much, much grosser than what the Prasangikas challenge. That's a much grosser level of object of negation. And then I want to point something else out that just recently, I mean, I've heard this before, just the other day where I was watching a video teaching of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he pointed this out. He said, you know how like in some of the teachings on meditation on emptiness, you do a practice. And the practice is like where you think of being falsely accused, or you think of being like attacked, or you think of some very, frightening event happening, or you can think of like falling down off a building or a cliff or something. And a very strong sense of I arises, right? And then you use that as the object of negation. I think most of you have tried that kind of meditation. And that's a very good meditation to do. It's a correct method. It's a correct thing to do, to meditate on emptiness. At one point, Lama Zopa he said, that's not the object, that's a grosser object of negation than the Prasangika school's object of negation. But we have to start somewhere, is the point, right? So it's very good, actually, right? To give rise to a very visceral sense of self, like to think of a time when somebody insulted you, right? And you get this like very heavy, gross sense of self that arises experientially, right? Like think of the time, if you think of a time when somebody really said something mean to you or disappointed you or upset you, you can get this very, in your chest, right? You can get this very kind of heavy sense of self. And then you have to ask yourself, first of all, just to refute that is huge. It's very positive. And that's an object of negation, right? But what I'm suggesting is and Lama Zopa, she said it, so I'm not just making it up. That's not the subtle object of negation of the Prasangika school. That might be the, permanent, unitary, independent, very gross level of self. And then I want to I'm just staying with the Vaibhashika school for a second. So they have a subtler one. And remember, I think it's very funny, isn't it? They're the least subtle of all the school's presentations, right? But they say a permanent, unitary, independent self is gross object of negation for them. And the subtle one would be the self-sufficient and substantially existent self, right? So what does that mean, self-sufficient and substantially existent? And my hope, if you're interested in Prasangika thought, is that you'll start going, well, that sounds the same as the Prasangikas. What's the difference? Self-sufficient, right? It says self-sufficient and substantially existent, right? So it's not self. So it means the self is not self-sufficient. It doesn't exist self-sufficiently, right? And from the Vaibhashika school's perspective, why doesn't it exist self-sufficiently? They would say because it's dependent upon the atomic particles and the moments of consciousness, right? You're made up of body and mind, and so your sense of self is dependent upon those. It's not self-sufficient in and of itself. There's not some self that exists independent of atoms and moments of consciousness for them, right? So they would say there's a self that exists conventionally, but it's not an ultimate truth because it's not self-sufficient. It depends upon moments of consciousness and particles, the parts of your body, the particles that make up your body. And so, and then you have to first of all think like, so can you even get in touch with your own sense? Because this is not, my point is, one point I'm making is that these ideas, and Lama Tsongkhapa says this in his various Lamrim texts, these are not intellectually acquired ideas. These are ideas, these are feelings, these are intuitive, what's the word? These are things where like, say it the right way, like, I've used this example the other day, actually. These are things where if you went to the grocery store now, and suddenly, like you turned a corner, like you're coming down an aisle and you turned a corner, and then like you've bumped right into somebody who was not wearing a mask, and they went like that. Something would come up in you, right? Like I may die now, right? This may be, like this person was wearing a mask and they just coughed right in my face, and a very visceral feeling would probably arise in your chest, right? Like maybe you think like, holy crap, maybe not, like, what can I do now, right? That's a feeling of self, right? And again, that's not the subtlest feeling of self that the Prasangikas are refuting. That's a grosser level of self. But that self would seem, and actually, and you might get, either you get scared, right? That sense of self based on that, right? When the person coughed right in your face, like from 2 feet away, it would feel, probably it would be the gross, right? Permanent, because I don't want to die, right? Unitary, singular, and independent, right? And what Buddhism is saying is that self is a superimposition. Right? But you get my point, that's a gross level of superimposition. And we need to refute that to eventually get to the subtle level of superimposition. In other words, it is an incorrect superimposition, but it's not the subtlest superimposition. Right? So if that person, when they cough right in your face, imagine that feeling that would come up, right? And that's a sense of self. But what I'm suggesting, and it's not just me, Lama Zopa was using this, he wasn't using that example, but he was making the same point. That's a gross level of self-grasping. And then, right, like the idea, I'll make one more point here, because like, the idea would be if you were practicing, so if you were going to practice in this way, right, you're talking about on this very, not less subtle level, right? You would think, right, like you would analyze, you would have that feeling, right, when the person coughed in your face, and you would hold on to that feeling, right? And then you would recognize, wow, that this kind of very solid, unitary, visceral me, right, that's threatened by that person's behavior or something. Like, if you ask, does that exist on any of the atoms? Is any of the atoms of my body that? It's the body that would get sick, but are any of the atoms of the body that thing? You have to say no. If you analyze, you can say no, right? It's not your fingernails, it's not your hair, it's not your left ventricle of your heart, it's not your amygdala, it's not your, you go through different parts, right? And then you can say those are just what's the word? Organs. But then if you get subtler, atoms that make up those organs, obviously they're not. The atoms, the whatever molecules and atoms that make up your body are not that. Right? And then moments of consciousness are not that, right? And so you can realize that you could have some realization, actually, wow, that thing doesn't exist. Right? And that's very profound. That's a kind of experience, that would be some kind of experiential realization of selflessness. And that would not, though, this is the tricky part, that would not be what Avalokiteshvara is getting at. That'll be much grosser than what Avalokiteshvara is getting at when he says, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. That's still grosser than what he's getting at. But that'd be profound. And it's an object of negation, but it's not the subtlest object of negation. I want to pause there and ask now, because I've covered a lot, and it's like we're a little past halfway. Any questions? You don't have to have. I don't want to go on and on without giving opportunity.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
In that example of someone coughing, so I'm just thinking, so if someone were in a higher level of, like, if someone has successfully negated that, mm-hmm. what would that person, how would that person be reacting to someone coughing? I'm just imagining that. How would that person with the higher level of realization be reacting to that situation? What would that look like?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Like, what would that, and I guess one thing that's really interesting, I think, if you think about your question, Cynthia, is that if you analyze it and sort of logically sort of think it through, right? People at different, like a Buddhist practitioner at different levels of realization, actual realization, would react differently. Like, and so, like, so you can imagine, for example, somebody who had realized the Vaibhashika level, right, of where they've, so that person is a practitioner, for Vaibhashika is a practitioner, first of all, of morality. They recognize impermanence, that things are changing instant by instant. And they recognize this level of selflessness, that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So I think actually, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that such a person would react with a kind of equanimity. In other words, that person, I think, would be able to recognize experientially, not just intellectually, even as the person's coughing, first of all, things are always impermanent. I may die any instant. Secondly, this already happened, right? Like once the person has coughed, I mean, they might still step away to get away from the germs or something, but they would have some recognition as they're stepping away, the event already happened. Things are impermanent. And they would have some kind of equanimity in the sense of not, because there wouldn't be a basis for them in getting extremely angry, for example, or getting terrified. Mm-hmm. I think that person would have some kind of equanimity. They would whatever, turn, go somewhere else, go to a different part of the area, continue their task. But I think actually such a person would have an even-mindedness. I want to share actually an example, like just to contrast it for a second. There are some stories and our actual teachings on this, like that there are some, it's not that, I mean, it wasn't exactly my example, but it's similar. I think it's the story of Tangtung Gyalpo, who was a great yogi of the Madhyamaka school. He was a Madhyamaka and a tantric practitioner. And there came a point where he was out somewhere, I'm just contrasting, he was so he was like the highest level of realization, actually. And there's a story, he was out somewhere and like, he would wander around Tibet, like he was a wandering yogi. And then a group of people found, like, some people came across him who were thugs or whatever, and they started beating him with sticks. And I guess he said, I can't remember the exact quote, the exact wording, but essentially he said his experience was incredible bliss as they were beating him up. Because he had realized the Prasangika view and conjoin that with the realizations of Tantra. So, for him, being assaulted was an experience of what they call innate bliss, they said, or something, incredible bliss. My point being, like, different Buddhist levels of practitioner would be different in their experience of such a moment. Does that make sense? Like, but I think somebody on the Vaibhashika level of experience, I think their experience would be equanimity, actually. It would be some kind of feeling of equanimity where they wouldn't, and so their behavior, I think, would be equanimous. Would probably be true.
Lauren?
Yeah. Oh, you got muted again somehow.
Sorry. You're going to find this, well, nonetheless. Refutation is, by the definition, experiential. Mm-hmm. And you see that as different from the intellectual understanding of the refutation of the object as what? And how is...
Say again, I'm not sure if I get it yet.
How is refutation, which is the experience, different from the intellectual understanding? What does that mean to you, the experience?
I'll answer it like, tell me if, I don't know if this gets at your question, but I'll say something about it and then tell me if this gets at it. Like, I think it's related to what the Dalai Lama was saying the other night when I was listening, where he was saying, first there comes a level of, that really is purely intellectual, which is study, like the level of he was saying this point, he was saying like, there's a level of understanding and even like realization in a way that comes through listening, through study, where, and he was making this point, he was saying, and you really can get like some kind of, deep intellectual benefit that really is useful. And that's, but he was making this point, he was saying, well, at that level, the level that's, that comes through study, he was saying, one is he was saying it's not just listening, you can actually think about, you think about what you've heard, in other words, it's like, but it's still, in order to grasp the idea of what you've heard, what he was saying was that that's very, very different from the level of realization that comes about through contemplation. So I'm differentiating those two. There are three types of wisdom, right? The wisdom arisen from listening, from contemplation, and from meditation. And so one point I'm sort of differentiating is that when we're still at the level of realization through study, like I'll give an example for myself of that. Like it comes, I remember like reading Jeffrey Hopkins' books about emptiness, right? And there comes a point where it's like you read them and I think this is what he means. No, maybe it's that. And you go, oh, wow. Like, you know, you read a sentence finally and then you go back and you think about it and you go, he's saying that. Oh, I get it. Like it's this, you know. That's amazing, actually. But the truth is, this is my personal example. Like I could come away from reading Jeffrey Hopkins' book and have that kind of experience. And then like, if, the truth is if I put the book down and went upstairs and if, I don't know, I'm making up a fictional example for a second, but if I hadn't left something out and Shayla said you left that out, you know, and was upset with me for leaving something out that I hadn't left out, I would probably get annoyed. Like I would probably be like, what are you talking about? I didn't leave that out. Like, no, you left that out. You know, like it's still pretty just intellectual. Whereas through contemplation, when you have the wisdom arisen from contemplation, it's like what's the say right there? I think you're bringing up the actual experience of the object of negation, and you're working with it in a more visceral way.
Meaning,
like at that level, it would be the sense of self that would get upset by Shayla's comment, for example, if it were that, you know, and I'd be working on that and going like, that doesn't exist. Here's why that doesn't exist. And you'd come to some kind of conviction experientially that doesn't exist. And that starts to affect your behavior.
How's that different from intellectual? You said understanding, conviction, experientially. How does that differ from understanding intellectually?
Oh, I see.
I'm sorry, but this is just...
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Because in a way, I guess what I'll say is like, it's an interesting point because it is using reasoning. So it's involving our intellect, you know, so it's not, I mean, maybe it's a kind of interesting point. I mean, there's not in one sense, both involve our intellect in the sense that we're using reasoning, don't they? That's what you're getting at, I think, is that they both involve, so I would agree with you. First of all, they both involve our intellect, they both involve reasoning, they both involve sort of thought, you know, and I guess to me that I'm just trying to think how, you know, the formal, I mean, I'm just separating out. I mean, formally, what do they say? They say that the wisdom arisen from listening. Let's see if this gets at it or not. Actually, it's interesting. Because what if you think from a formal Buddhist perspective, what they say is that the wisdom arisen from listening is still through the power of somebody else's words and their understanding, you know, and you're starting to get your own understanding, but based on their explanation, whether it be verbal or written. Whereas what they say actually is that, or one way of formally differentiating them is that the wisdom arisen through contemplation comes about in a way through your own personal reflection, through your own personal, so it's no longer based on somebody else's understanding and words at that point. It's based on your own personal introspective contemplation. And so I guess, I mean, maybe, gosh, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, to sort of agree with part of your point, first of all, it is still conceptual, right? So in that sense, it's still intellectual. I think the difference is that because it's arisen from your own personal understanding. And also, I guess I'll make one other point. The reason why I use the word conviction, because maybe, I don't know if intellectualize is the wrong, intellectual sort of gets it, but not entirely. Because one is, the difference is the other is arisen through another, this is arisen through your own. But that when you come to it through your own internal introspective process, there is something that happens, and Buddhist teachers say this, I'm not just making it up, but what they say is that you develop, first of all, it's like, because it's come about through your own process of reflection and introspection and analysis, you gain a confidence and a certainty of the truth of it, right? And I think the idea is that through the certainty and the confidence in it, it starts to affect your behavior.
At that point, is it non-conceptual?
No, it's still conceptual. It would still be considered conceptual. So that's where maybe the word intellectual is a little tricky. It's still conceptual, but at that point, the conceptual is with conviction and with a kind of, with a conviction and a certainty. And it's like, to me, it's the difference between, it's like the difference, I just want to give I'm going back to the example I gave at the very beginning of Sam and smoking. It's like, when Sam was 58, and if I had said to him, hey, do you agree with the research that smoking makes cigarette smoking makes you more likely to have cancer and COPD and to die younger? He wasn't a total idiot. He would have said, yeah, it's probably true. Whatever, the CDC says it, and all the, Harvard and Princeton and whoever, like Yale University Medical School and the New England Journal of Medicine, they all say that it must be true. But then he would say, now pass the cigarette. There was not a personal, it was through somebody else's. Whereas when the doctor said, don't get out of here, don't come back, you're going to drop dead, I don't want to see you again, he had some kind of, it was still intellectual. It wasn't non-conceptual. There was nothing non-conceptual about it. It was just, it got through and it became his own personal experience of.
Isn't the direct perception non-conceptual?
Yeah, and I'm not at direct perception now. I mean, these are all before direct perception.
But you don't think the refutation occurs through direct perception?
No, it doesn't.
It's still just an intellectual exercise.
It's still conceptual. I mean, to use a more technically correct term from a Buddhist perspective, it's still conceptual, for sure. Yeah, at this level, at the level we're talking about, it's still definitely conceptual. It's not a direct perception. It's a conceptual, even at the, because even somebody who's gained calm abiding and special insight, right, which is unbelievably powerful on the path of preparation, it's still conceptual at that level. So for sure, at this level, what we're talking about would be conceptual.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah, Alex.
When you talked about the contemplations of imagining oneself to be in danger or being perhaps unjustly accused, that giving rise to some sort of a sense of fear or maybe some kind of indignation, I've thought of that as those responses are not the object of negation that we're trying to identify there. They are useful because we can infer that they arise from a sense of an independent self, which we can't really observe or identify easily. But when those experiences arise, we have kind of an experience that sense of an independent self is definitely there. And then having that kind of experience, we could then ask ourselves, well, how does that self exist? Is that right?
First of all, yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. Like, in other words, like the object of negation in these cases. I mean, actually, it's interesting. We keep getting at something subtle in a way. Like, I mean, you're raising a lot of interesting points, I think. Like, in one way, actually, I mean, technically, if I get back to, if I say from a Buddhist perspective, technically from one perspective, you could say even the emotions, in a way, end up becoming objects of negation in the sense that they will be negated if you realize selflessness. But they're not the main object of negation, you're correct. The main object of negation is the sense of self that underlies them. And because they can only exist relying upon a superimposition of a self, but that superimposition of a self is the actual object of negation. So you're correct about that. And you're right though. So in other words, when you realize selflessness, those emotions will also subside, by the way, but they're not what we're trying to get rid of at that point. What we're trying to do actually is, yeah, you're right. It is like to look. So like if you're feeling fear, I'll use that example, right? If the emotion were fear, it could be indignation, it could be any number of emotions. But if I pick the example of fear, so when the fear arises, I mean, of course, if you're doing this meditation, you would notice the fear. But you're right. Then you look in your own introspective, with your own introspective awareness for where is my experience of a sense of self that underlies that fear, and how do I experience that sense of self? Where do I experience it in my body? What is it like? What does it feel like? How does it appear to me? Or does it appear in my mind? Does it appear? In what way does it appear experientially to me in the context of that moment? And then you actually hold on to that sense of self. What they actually say in the teachings is, once you can identify an example in your own experience in an exercise like that of, like in one time, maybe in the, one day you may feel like it's right there in the center of your chest or something, but another day it may feel more like it's some owner of the, it's like the owner of the aggregates and it's somewhere more abstract or something. It's whatever your experience is of a self in that moment. And then you hold on to that, and that becomes the object of refutation. You don't let that go. You kind of keep that in your mind, and then you start analyzing it from different angles. So yeah, you're correct. So it's not the emotion. The emotion is just what, when we're first trying to get familiar with what is the object of negation, we just go to those extremes because we're not used to noticing our sense of self. So like you said, it's useful to have this extreme, indignation or fear or anger or whatever it would be, because then our sense of self sort of is more obvious if we're not used to introspecting. Then as we continue practicing, we can get subtler and subtler and more identify the sense of self even without the extreme emotions. But at the beginning, it's very useful. That's what they say.
Thank you.
Okay. So now, so we've been talking now about different objects of negation. Oh, there was one other comment. Let me just see if I can see it. Oh, Linda posted, wouldn't he feel compassion for the people who were beating him, knowing this is possibly creating bad karma, possibly bliss encompasses or goes beyond compassion? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, like I think he probably did feel compassion at one point, Linda. So I think you're correct. But yeah, like in highest yoga tantra completion stage, you're right though. They sometimes talk about that, like that. First of all, one still has bodhicitta, so one still has compassion, and at that level, though, they sometimes talk about the main some kind of bliss becomes the main method aspect of the path, or becomes an important method aspect of the path. So in a way, bliss and compassion are connected in the sense they're both method on the method side. But that experience of that particular kind of bliss he would have was unique to tantric practice and was kind of a method. So it is connected to bodhicitta, but it's a kind of tantric expression of method is bliss. And that was in the chat. I don't know if everybody can see the chat. Paul asked. It was a comment in the chat that Linda had posted. I just saw yours too, Paul. I don't know if does everybody see chat, or do I only see it? I don't even know that.
If it's directed to you, only you can see it.
Oh, it's only directed to me. Okay, so Linda had asked a question, so I was just answering it. Sorry, I thought everybody could see the chat. I'm not so familiar with Zoom. I guess I'm getting more familiar as we go along. This many months into the pandemic, I should be more familiar with Zoom. I've used it, but okay. So then I want to go back so I'll go back now to Avalokiteshvara's statement in the Sutra, where he says, right, so this has all been to try to understand what Avalokiteshvara is, one sentence, right, where he makes this point. I'll just use the phrase, right, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. And so, oh, I see, now you did it to everybody, good. And so empty of inherent nature, right? I'm going to say now is that what he is, oh, no problem, Alex. So what he is getting at there, right, is empty of the object of negation, which in this case is inherent nature. And how do I say this correctly, the most accurate way? I guess I'll say it this way. I'm going to now talk about the Prasangika school for a second. Right? And Prasangika, right, is the school of Chandrakirti, which is considered the most subtle, as I've said, the most subtle presentation of emptiness. And the Prasangika's position in terms of inherent nature means, you could say, objective existence, or that there's something, and this, it's a very radical position, actually, I think, really. But here, the object of negation is existing from its own side. I'm going to call it that. Like inherent nature, right? Inherent means from its own side, right? Inherent means, like, you know, you could say independently, but from its own side. I'm going to use that term, like someone said Dalai Lama the other day used the word objective existence, right? So existence from the side of the object, whether the object is the self or body or tree or cup or whatever. So I'm going to use different words: objective existence, or existence from its own side, existence by nature, or existence with inherent nature. That's the term in the sutra, right? They're all synonyms from the Prasangika position. And so this is why the sutra is considered, why I'm going to present it as Prasangika, right? One is it's perfection of wisdom, and it's the Madhyamakas who are they consider the Prajnaparamita Sutras to be the definitive teachings of the Buddha. Right? So we're going to look at it from a Madhyamaka perspective. But this is the tricky part, in a way, why this statement of Avalokiteshvara also empty of inherent, the five aggregates are also empty of inherent nature. And I said the first time I talked about that sentence, that what it means is that, and the traditional explanation is that the five aggregates are empty of an inherently existent self, and they're also, each of the five aggregates is also empty of inherent nature itself, right? And what they're getting at, what Avalokiteshvara there is getting at, is that the self is a superimposition, right? But that from a Madhyamaka perspective, from a Prasangika perspective, it doesn't exist from its own side. And what I want to talk about how radical that object of negation is. So there, the object of negation is existence from its own side. Does that make sense? That's what I'm asserting, is that's the Prasangika position on the object of negation. What I'm going to say is all other Buddhist schools of philosophy, so even other Buddhist philosophers, disagree, actually. They say things do exist from their own side. And, so they would say, like, for example, and in their view, if there's nothing coming from the side of the object, right? If things don't exist from the side of the object in terms of how they exist, then they wouldn't exist at all. Whereas the Prasangika school says, no, how things exist is merely labeled, or merely through designation, which means they don't have existence from their own side. So it's a radical difference, actually. Only the Prasangika school says that. And in terms of a self of persons, now I'm going to go back to the self of persons idea. Right? Like the Vaibhashikas, right? I said, like, they would say there is no permanent, unitary, independent self. Right? They would say there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. But when you ask them, what's the illustration of a self? Does the self not exist at all? They would say, no, it exists conventionally, because ultimately there are atoms and there are moments of consciousness. Right? That would be their assertion. So there's some basis, right, from the side of the object that's ultimately existent. And even though we superimpose a permanent, unitary, independent self, they would say that's a superimposition that does exist conventionally, but there is an ultimate, something ultimately that exists from the side of the object, which are partless particles and moments of consciousness. Now, of course, what would a Prasangika say to that? The Prasangika would say what actually even the mind-only school refutes the partless particles, right? They would say, well, how can there be a partless particle? You know, if there were a particle with no parts, then you couldn't accumulate them, right? Because how do you accumulate particles, right? If, in other words, something has to go next to something else, right? Like even atoms, right? There have to be an accumulation of atoms. They have to have parts because there's one that's to the east and one that's to the left, or one's on the right, and this, you know, up and down. And so they would say it's impossible to have partless particles. All particles have parts, and if it has a part, then it's not what's the word? Then even from the Vaibhashika's perspective, you'd have to say, well, then it's not what's the word? It could fall apart under further analysis, right? And therefore, it's not an ultimate truth. But so my point is that all other Buddhist schools assert something, right? That's that has inherent nature. Actually, that's the using Avalokiteshvara's term, right? Inherent nature. So from the mind-only school's perspective, for example, the mind has inherent nature. Even from like the anyway, even from, and actually it's quite tricky, even the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, they would say nothing ultimately is truly existent, but they would say for something to be conventionally existent, and you can actually see, I want to point this out, this is how subtle the Prasangika perspective is. The Svatantrika Madhyamikas would say that for things to exist, they exist dependently. They exist as dependent arisings. And for them, dependent arising means you need a subjective perceiver and you need something coming from the side of the object. And then things exist because they're dependent, right? It depends upon the perceiver and the perceived, right? That the perceiver has to have a valid cognition of the object, but also the object has to, bring something to the interaction. And that's the way in which things exist. So from their perspective, they would say things do have some kind of existence from their own side. The Prasangika perspective is that things do exist conventionally, right? This is the Prasangika perspective. Things exist conventionally, but things do not exist from their own side. So that's the object of negation. I'm just pointing out, I'm just differentiating, right? The object of negation from a Prasangika, you could say it that way, is things existing from their own side. And that's the unique, most subtle object of negation. And we still have a little bit of time. And I want to point out now why going back, now I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. So that I just want to make sure we covered that. That's the object of negation from a process. The most subtle object of negation is existence from its own side. That's what they would say. Inherent nature means inherent, right? Means from its own side, intrinsic, right? And then nature, it exists naturally there from its own side. That's their definition. And that's what Avalokiteshvara is getting at here, right? So he's saying things are empty of that kind of existence. And now I think, actually, I hope you can see one is like, that's subtle. Another is, one thing that is just last night, as Lama said, the most difficult part that he actually quoted Lama Tsongkhapa. He was quoting Lama Tsongkhapa, and Lama Tsongkhapa says the most difficult part of the Prasangika view is to be able to assert simultaneously things do not exist from their own side and things exist conventionally and function. And that's the Prasangika perspective. Things do exist conventionally, things function, but they have no self-existence. They have no existence from their own side. They have no inherent nature. And part of one is I want to, one is we needed to do this because now to discuss the Heart Sutra, you have to know what do the Prasangikas mean. That's the perspective we're giving. But I also want to say, now I hope you can also see why grosser object of negation are really useful, aren't they? Because that's a very subtle one. And now you can see why, like, it's really useful sometimes, right? From a practice, really, like to imagine turning a corner and somebody coughing right on you, with no mask. and going, oh, the sense of self that would arise. That's much grosser, right? That's what Lama Zopa Rinpoche was saying. He didn't use that example. He was saying, but he was using the same example. He was saying he was doing a Tibetan example. I've once told that story. Gyumri Khenpo Rinpoche said he had this experience with Trijang Rinpoche, the junior tutor to His Holiness Dalai Lama, where Trijang Rinpoche took a bunch of students up, like on a cliff in Tibet. You can imagine how high the cliffs must be in Tibet with the highest mountains in the world. And he would, each student would have the experience where others would hold them so they were safe, but they would like act as if they were about to get shoved off a cliff, right? And a sense of self would arise. And then they would meditate on that sense of self, right? So Lama Zopa Rinpoche was giving that example. He was saying like, as if you're going to fall off a cliff, right? That. And I remember that once when I was in college, I had the experience. I was on a cliff and I didn't know there was like a shooting range somewhere nearby. I think it was like a military or police training range. I didn't know it was there. So I walked very close to the cliff to look down, and right then all these gunshots went off. I leapt back, it was like didn't know what was going on. And a very strong sense of self arose, right? So it's like that, right? That's a gross sense of self. And, I sometimes use that example. I remember that moment and think, oh, that's a sense of self. That's gross, right? But that's very useful, right? Because this one is very subtle. And we have to start, and I guess my point is like, so we need to then be able to recognize there are different objects of negation, right? Some of them, and as Chandrakirti was saying, I mentioned last time, right? Some of them don't even have to do with emptiness, right? Like seeing what's a cause of pain as pleasurable, right? That's not emptiness. That's not what we talk about shunyata, but that's an object of negation that's very profound, right? If you're caught up in attachment to something, which we all are sometimes, right? And then seeing the impermanent as permanent. That's an object of negation, right? Or superimposition of permanence. That's not shunyata, not emptiness, but it's quite profound. And then once we get into emptiness, there are different levels of subtlety of the object of negation, right? From a permanent, unitary, independent one to a self-sufficient, substantially existent one. But the prasangika one, right, which is the most subtle, I'm going to read one way of describing it. Things existing as more than what is merely labeled by the mind, right? Or things existing from their own side. That's the object of negation for a prasangika. And what I want to suggest is this, is as we go forward now in the class, we're going to talk about ways of refuting the object of negation and, what the Heart Sutra says about how things are empty and so on. But what I wanted to suggest is this, is a few points. One is the object of negation, to understand it, correctly. Lama Tsongkhapa, so it's not me making it up, says, that's a prerequisite, and it's the most important. It's it's like the most important part. In the Lamrim Chenmo, in the great treatise on the stages of the path, which is translated into English, he has a huge section on how you can, you have to be careful not to, if your object of negation is too broad, right? If you make it it's too, then you refute that, you wind up with nihilism, right? If you refute too much, in other words, then you can become nihilistic. If you refute too little, then you still leave something existing from its own side there, right? Which means you still grasp. And, there's a famous quote from Nagarjuna, where in essence he says, he makes his point, I'm not going to get the exact wording, but essentially what he says is, if you refute, and this is what His Holiness was talking about, that example I gave earlier with the lightning bolt experience, like if you refute just your sense of self, but you still grasp at the aggregates as having some inherent nature, then your sense of self will reassert itself, right? So that's why Avalokiteshvara says the 5 areas also is empty of inherent nature. He's saying you have to realize the ultimate truth as it's presented by the Prasangika Majjhimaka, which is what, which is the ultimate perspective on this. You have to realize the emptiness of the self of persons and also of the aggregates themselves, that they're also empty of inherent nature, or empty of existence from their own side. And if you realize that, that's then you're going to Ling Rinpoche's comment. Then that's the yogi of space, right? That's the actual ultimate truth. But then, of course, from a practical perspective for us as practitioners, we're going to study that, and we're going to go into how do you refute that, and we're going to go into like the meaning of the Heart Sutra, the rest of the Heart Sutra. We've gone quite far now, but I guess what I want to say is, in terms of your own meditation practice, though, then each of us has to work with the level of object of negation that we can actually identify, and that you can, that is relevant to your current level. That was why I was praising. I was mentioning, right, like that friend of mine who said, "Oh, I'm adopting the mind only, the Chittamatran perspective for my practice." It was like he recognized that's what's actually going to help him progress for now. Does that make sense? So my point is like, on the one hand, we need to know what is the object of negation from the Prasangika school, because that's the ultimate object of negation. And we need to know what that is if we're going to study this. From a practice perspective, if you're working with a grosser one, if you need to think about, somebody insulting you, and then a very gross object of negation arises, good, that's amazing, right? That's very useful. And only by refuting that over and over and over, then we can start to see subtler experiences of how we grasp it as self. But if we never reflect on how do I personally grasp it as self, then you can't refute anything, actually, right? Like there's nothing, you don't know, we have to, because those of you who are in the middle length Lam Rim teachings, Lama Tsongkhapa made some interesting points there too, right? Where he made this point that he really differentiated very clearly in that text. He was saying the object of negation, there are texts that refute what he called intellectually acquired objects of negation. Those would be like, object of negation gained through study, right? Like studying a wrong doctrine. Like, so if you had an idea that like I have an eternal soul that was created just before I was born by God and was some unitary, singular entity, that's divine and something like that, and permanent, and created by a prime mover unmoved, a divine being who somehow creates that without changing, right? That would be an object of negation too, but those are intellectually acquired. Those are learned objects of negation. What we're getting at are what he called innate objects of negation, right? They're things that we're born with. They're things that animals have too, they're that instinctual. They're things that we've acquainted to since beginningless time in samsara. Does that make sense? So they're innate to our samsaric existence. They're not innate in the sense they're indestructible. They can be destroyed through wisdom. But the objects of negation that we're getting at, especially the subtle ones, grasping it as self, they've been with us since beginningless time. And our job is to introspect now. So that's what I want to suggest as homework for everybody, is to now introspect and look for different levels of your own experience of object. Look, because this is actual real practice now, right? Is to look at, well, what do I project and superimpose that's very gross and not even about emptiness? Like, for example, desirability onto things that are causes of pain, or permanence, or purity and wonderfulness onto things that are contaminated, things like that, right? And then how do I superimpose a sense of self, right? And so I give these examples, right? If somebody coughed, or if you were going to fall off a cliff, or if suddenly somebody took all your money, stole everything from you, or something, the sense of self that would arise, right? And then get subtler and subtler, right? Who's the self when when you wake up in the morning? What's your sense of self? Right? When you look in the mirror, what's your sense of self? Sometimes people on these Zoom calls, sometimes people say, oh, when I see my own image, I feel uncomfortable, right? Or something, or I feel some feeling. So even when you're on a Zoom call, look at your own image and check out, what do you feel, right? And do you feel different when you look at your image versus somebody else's image? In other words, what is your sense? I'm just suggesting like introspecting and exploring what is my actual experience of a grasping at a self. Right? And anyway, and my point, I guess, is that there are gross objects of negation, there are subtle objects of negation, and then there's the extremely subtle object of negation, which is the one I mentioned from the Prasangika, right? Existing from its own side, or existing as more than what is merely labeled by the mind. I have to be careful though, because again, remember, things do exist conventionally, Buddha's getting it from the Prasangika. So how do they exist conventionally? As merely labeled by the mind. That's the Prasangika perspective, which is different than the other schools' perspectives, right? Yeah, so anyway, I mean, there's more I could say, but I'll stop there for a moment and just say, so one is I want to suggest that as homework. It's not like to write something down or something, but to start to actually introspect and notice, and just about yourself, you know, how do I experience a sense of self? And where is the object of negation that's an exaggeration? Do I experience a sense of self that exists from its own side? Do I experience a sense of self that seems to be permanent, unitary, independent, self-sufficient, substantially existent? Right? Sometimes we talk about substantially existent. Sometimes, you know, people, if you read subtext, they'll talk about like, what's the word? Like solid, right? Solid. Sometimes we have an experience like that. The sense of self seems very solid, like substantially existent. That's still gross from a Prasangika perspective, but that's very profound, actually. Right? So if you can find the sense of self that seems solid or substantially existent, that's very useful then, right? To look at that. And so we're looking at the object of negation, or looking at our sense of self, you could say, our sense of solid self, our sense of permanent self, our sense of independent self, and ultimately our sense of a self that exists from its own side. Any questions again? Just pause there. Because if not, then I'll, oh, okay, good. Then maybe I'll make one last point for this, because I think that was what I wanted to say mostly about the, so the object of negation, right? So just remember that though for future classes, right? One is we have to correctly identify the object of negation. If you make it, if you refute too much, then you would wind up with nihilism. If you don't refute enough, you wind up with something that's in a way eternalism, right? Some idea of things things are truly existent, and then you won't get free. So we have to correctly identify the object of negation in a precise way. And again, there are different positions on what it is, but the ultimate one is, like I said, you know, more than merely labeled by the mind, existing from its own side. And but again, from a practical perspective, work with whichever level of object of negation you can identify experientially. And if you do that correctly, then you'll progress. Actually, maybe was where I was going to go, but I'll share one more story. You know, I was saying this point about like what His Holiness Dalai Lama said and what Lama Tsongkhapa's experience with Manjushri. But there's one other story I often find very helpful myself. I've often thought about this. Like, there's a story that Baba Viveka, you know, who's a great Buddhist philosopher, Madhyamaka philosopher. He was the founder of the Svatantrika school of Madhyamaka. It's the other Madhyamaka sub-school. And he was the one who said things do have some objective existence, that they're dependently arisen means that there's something from the side of the perceiver and something from the side of the perceived, but that conventionally things do have to have some existence from their own side. That was Baba Viveka's position. And, you know, and he wrote wonderful Buddhist philosophical texts on that, on a Madhyamaka from his perspective, which were incredibly profound and very helpful. And His Holiness Dalai Lama teaches them, and you can study them and things like that. Some of them are translated, some of his texts are translated. But again, I'm getting to this point of what's useful. Like, you know, he practiced that, and he was a great master and a great yogi. He didn't, in that lifetime, realize the final view. Does that make sense? He realized the level of view that he expounded. And they say, though, that the Buddhist teachers say when he died, he took rebirth as Gantapa. His next rebirth, Baba Viveka died with a very high level of realization, but not yet having seen emptiness, because in the correct way, ultimate way, because of this point. But in his next lifetime, he took rebirth as Gantapa, who is one of the most important lineage masters of the Chakrasamvara Tantra. And they say that in that lifetime, he became a Buddha in one life. You know, so my point is like, you know, I sometimes think this, like, you know, on the one hand, it's good to understand the ultimate view, right? The ultimate position of the Prasangikas. But, you know, Baba Viveka worked at the level he could work at that actually transformed him, right? He made humongous progress at a very, you know, in his practice through asserting the Svatantrika Madhyamaka perspective. And he made so much progress that in his next life, he became a fully enlightened Buddha, you know, but not in that lifetime. And that's better, for example, than I think that's a better approach, isn't it? Than, you know, sort of saying, you know, that what's there to say, right? That we have to, then not engaging at the level we can actually practice. I guess that's my point. That we have to engage with the practice at the level that transforms us. Does that make sense? And lets us progress. And you can know, oh, the ultimate view is the prasangika, and I, you know, want to understand that. But again, if you're feeling, you know, if you're feeling hatred for somebody, you know, then, you know, it may be an incredibly solid sense of self. That's the more like the substantially existent one that you have to work with. You see, does that make sense? And refute that first, you know, and if that's what helps you to be less hateful, then that's what you should do at that time, is my point. And eventually, if you do that, we'll all eventually get to the level where we experience this most subtle object of negation in our own experience, and then can refute that.
I'm sorry, Lord.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, because I was thinking to go on to another point, but I think it's not time. So go ahead.
I have a question. So, like, I get, like, intellectually, you know, your thoughts, all these titles that you put on yourself or your perception unrealistically, like emptiness, right? And then yourself of emptiness. But then you can go on and, like, you know, you talk about nihilism, and you go further into, like, this planet, the universe, all emptiness, right? Where do you stop, or where does it, because if you actually think about, like, the universe or everything else, wouldn't it be all dependent on something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll make a point, like, you know, the idea really, especially from, you know, from this prasangika perspective, is that emptiness and dependence are synonyms, actually. There is, like, so things are empty of, to use Avalokiteshvara's phrase, empty of inherent nature, right? So they're empty of, inherent means from their own side, because they're dependent on other things. There is, so that's actually exactly right, Edwin. You know, in other words, like, so the reason why things are empty of inherent nature is because they're dependent upon other factors. And all things are dependently arisen or interdependent, you know, and so they sometimes give the example, right? Like, I mean, there are countless examples of this, right? But, like, you know, say big and small, right? Whereas, like, they're mutually dependent, right? Like, in other words, big is only big in relation to something smaller than it. Small is only small in relation to something bigger than it. There is no such, you know, to think that there's an inherently existent small would be silly, right? Because it's only small relationally, you know, and dependently, interdependently, dependent upon some other thing by which you could measure it. And so you're right. In other words, the idea is that everything in the universe is interdependent and dependently arisen, and therefore it's each of those things, you know, and emptiness is not separate from them. It's their nature, so that they're empty of existing with an inherent nature, nature. What's the word? Inherently, an inherent nature, and a nature from its own side, right? Which means independently or separately, in a sense, because things exist dependently. So you're exactly right. In other words, you could say, they sometimes say that from the prasangika perspective, dependent origination and emptiness are synonyms. They mean the same thing. So does that answer your question, though?
I guess so, yes. It's pretty much. So how would you be nihilistic if you think, like, I mean, I'm not saying I'm there yet, right? But intellectually, I understand what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
right? That the universe doesn't really exist because it's independently arisen.
Or interdependent, you mean, right?
Interdependently,
Yeah.
right? So where, like, how would you be nihilistic, or how would you, I don't like.
Well, first of all, if you're not leaning towards nihilism, that's a good thing. Because the goal, actually, from a Buddhist perspective, and from a Buddhist perspective, nihilism would be the worst mistake one could make. In other words, Buddhist position is that if you take this teaching on emptiness and you go towards nihilism, saying things don't exist, that causality doesn't exist, that karma doesn't exist, that nothing exists at all, for example, that would be nihilism, and they would say that's the most evil of views. Actually, it really is evil. I've been thinking about that recently, because when you're nihilistic, if somebody were to go to nihilism, then if nothing matters, then you can do anything, and then people do it. Whereas it's really in nihilism. Nihilism gives room for the most horrific behaviors. So it's terrible, actually. But and that's not what you're doing. You're not leaning towards nihilism, which is good. So that's my point. But the way sometimes that some people do that is if they think things have many people, or is that what even some Buddhist philosophers would say, that if things don't exist from their own side, they think that they don't exist at all. And they don't recognize that not existing from their own side means that they exist interdependently. So that's the mistake some people make, is not recognizing that things being empty of existing from their own side. Some people can't understand that's how they exist. They think, oh, that means they must not exist. That things have to exist from their own side, out there, with some kind of nature of their own, or else they must not exist at all. That's the mistake some people make. And it sounds like you're not leaning towards that, so that's a good thing. But that would be the mistake some people make, where then they could fall into nihilism. And so that's the danger, is all. That was what I was getting at when I mentioned that.
Okay, thank you. I understand a little bit.
Okay, because you can see how somebody could think that, right? Like they could think somebody could think, well, if a tree, if a tree doesn't exist inherently, then they would think, well, then it doesn't, then it's not real. So who cares if I burn down all the trees or something like that? That would be like ignorant, right? And what Prasangika Madhyamaka view would say is, trees don't exist inherently because they're dependent upon, seed and soil and sunlight, and those things are dependent upon all the other, right? The sunlight is dependent upon the existence of the sun, which is dependent upon all the other factors, right? The entire history of the universe, actually, in one way. So things are interdependent and dependently arisen. But yeah, so you get the point. The nihilistic person would misunderstand that point and think because it doesn't exist from its own side, it doesn't exist, so who cares? So I can do anything. That's a mistake. And we should stop. But so anyway, we're scheduled for, is it next? I can't remember if it's next week. Yeah, next week we've got the class. So we'll continue on, and next week we'll go into. So next week we'll start now on the that famous fourfold emptiness, right? Form is empty. Next week we're going to get into now we've covered the object of negation. What is emptiness in general? So next week we're going to get into that paragraph. Form is emptiness. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form also is not other than emptiness. Next week we'll go into that. And what does that mean? And now we have the context to be able to explore that. Does that make sense? I wanted to cover the object of negation and the general meaning of emptiness. So now we can get into that, right? What does it mean? That famous fourfold. That's like the most famous lines, I think, from the Sutra. So we'll sort of delve into those next class. But let's do our dedication. So the supreme jewel Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
very
Lauren.
much, everybody.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you,
Thanks.
Lauren.
Good to see everybody. Good to see you.